You already know what Vikings were not afraid of. You've absorbed that much from 1,000 years of reputation management. They were not afraid of dying in battle. They were not afraid of pain. They were not afraid of the sea, which tried to kill them constantly and which they treated as a commute. They raided monasteries full of unarmed monks, and they did it on purpose, specifically because those places were undefended and full of valuable things, and they felt exactly zero moral conflict about that. The image that has come down to us across the centuries is of men who had essentially removed fear from their operating system, fearless, relentless, the thing that came out of the fog and took what it wanted and left. That image is, in the most important ways, completely wrong. Not because Vikings weren't violent or skilled or genuinely terrifying to the people they raided. They were all of those things, and the historical record is not ambiguous about it. But the image of the fearless Viking collapses the moment you start reading what they actually believed, what kept them awake, what their myths were actually about, what they built their entire understanding of the universe around. Because what you find when you go looking is a civilization that was not defined by the absence of fear. It was defined by a specific, sophisticated, deeply serious relationship with the things it feared. And those things are stranger and more interesting than anything the television version of Vikings would have you believe. Let's start with the thing that was so frightening to the Norse mind that they built their entire cosmology around it. Not a monster, not an enemy army, not drowning or starvation or any of the physical dangers that their lives were genuinely full of. The end of everything. Ragnarok. The twilight of the gods. The event that was not a myth in the modern sense of something that didn't happen, but a future certainty that had been prophesied and could not be avoided. The gods themselves, Odin and Thor and Tyr and Freyr, knew it was coming. They had been told by the Norns, the beings who weave fate, that there would come a winter that does not end, that the wolf Fenrir would break his chains, that the Midgard serpent would rise from the ocean and poison the sky, that the gods would fight and most of them would die and the world would sink into the sea, and the gods were preparing for it. Valhalla, which popular culture treats as a Viking version of heaven, a party hall full of mead and glory, was actually a military staging ground. Odin collected the souls of slain warriors specifically to build an army large enough to fight at Ragnarok. Every warrior who died in battle and was chosen for Valhalla was being recruited for a war against the end of the world. The mead and the feasting were real in the mythological sense, but they were not the point. The point was the army. The point was having enough fighters ready for the day when the wolves swallowed the sun and the moon and the long winter began, and everything that existed was going to have to be defended. Think about what it means to build a civilization on that foundation, not on the idea that the gods are eternal and the world is stable and history is moving towards something good, but on the explicit understanding that the world will end, the gods will fall, and the best anyone can do is fight well when the time comes. The Norse psychological framework was not optimistic. It was something harder and stranger than optimism. It was a kind of unflinching acknowledgement that existence is temporary and violent and ends badly, combined with a decision to act with courage and honor anyway, precisely because those things have value independent of whether they save you. That is a remarkable thing to build a culture on. And it produces a very specific kind of fear, not the fear of death, which the Norse framework had largely absorbed and metabolized into something manageable, but the fear of dying badly. The fear of dying in a way that was shameful or meaningless or without witnesses. The fear of straw death. Straw death was the old Norse term for dying in bed. Dying of illness or old age in your house, on the straw that covered the floor. It sounds to modern ears like an entirely reasonable way to go. To a Viking warrior, it was among the worst fates imaginable. Not because they didn't understand that illness happened or that old age came for everyone eventually, but because the entire system of meaning that structured their lives depended on a specific kind of death. Dying in battle, weapon in hand, against an opponent worthy of the fight, was the gateway to Valhalla. Dying on straw was dying outside the story. It was dying without the moment that made all the other moments matter. The historical record contains accounts of terminally ill Norse warriors who had themselves carried to the battlefield when they were too sick to stand, so that they could die technically in combat rather than on their beds. There are accounts of men who pricked themselves with a spear point at the moment of natural death, claiming Odin's mark, attempting to convert a straw death into a warrior's death through a technicality of spiritual classification. The sagas describe men who refused to be carried inside when wounded, who insisted on dying seated upright against a wall or propped against a tree, because dying lying down was too close to dying in bed. These are not the actions of men without fear. These are the actions of men in the grip of a very specific terror about the quality and meaning of their own death. The fear was not of death itself, but of the wrong kind of death, which is a much harder fear to manage because it follows you everywhere. You can avoid a battlefield. You cannot avoid your own eventual deterioration. The fear of being forgotten operated alongside this and in some ways exceeded it. The Norse concept of lasting fame, what they called alof in Old Norse, was not vanity. It was a genuine metaphysical category. In a worldview where the afterlife options were not straightforwardly appealing, where hell, the realm of those who died of illness or old age, was a cold, gray, diminished place with no particular suffering, but also no particular joy. The primary mode of survival was memory. If people remembered you, if your deeds were sung, if your name was spoken by living people around living fires, then you continued to exist in a meaningful sense. The moment the last person who knew your name died, you were truly gone. This produced a cultural obsession with reputation that went far deeper than ego. A Viking raid was not just an economic activity, though it was that. It was not just an expression of aggression, though it was that too. It was, at a fundamental level, a bid for the kind of renown that would keep your name alive after your body was gone. The saga tradition, the long prose narratives of Norse deeds and genealogies and feuds, was not entertainment in the modern sense. It was a preservation system. Getting into a saga meant surviving death. Being omitted from the record meant a second, final annihilation. The Norse term for this living death of obscurity was nid, a concept that combined disgrace and social erasure into a single category of horror. To be nid was to be as good as dead while still breathing. Warriors challenged each other with nid accusations because there was almost nothing worse you could say about a man than that he was someone who would not be remembered, someone whose name would die with him, someone who would leave no trace on the living world. The intensity of that fear produced the intensity of the deeds performed to escape it. Now let's talk about the things that frightened them, that were not cosmic in scale, but intensely physically immediate. Draugr, the Norse undead. Not vampires, not zombies in the modern sense, but something that combined features of both in a way that was specific to the Norse understanding of death and the body. A Draugr was the reanimated corpse of someone who had died and for various reasons refused to stay dead. The reasons varied. A man who had been buried with his possessions might come back to protect them. A man who had died with unresolved grudges might return to settle them. A man who had been buried improperly, whose grave rites had been skipped or botched, was at particular risk. The Draugr was not a metaphor. It was not a symbolic representation of grief or guilt, though it carried those resonances. It was a physical threat. The Norse sagas describe Draugr with the matter-of-fact specificity of eyewitness accounts. They are unnaturally strong. They can change size, swelling to enormous dimensions. They smell of decay in a way that is itself dangerous, that can cause illness in the living. They crush people, tear them apart, drive them mad. They are not just frightening. They are actively predatory. The practical response to this fear was embedded in burial practice in ways that archaeologists have documented extensively. Burial mounds were constructed with specific features intended to prevent the dead from leaving. Heavy stones were sometimes placed on bodies. Doors in burial chambers were faced inwards specifically to confuse a Draugr trying to find its way out. Some bodies were buried in what researchers call prone position, face down, so that if they tried to dig their way out, they would go deeper rather than up. There are archaeological finds of bodies with their heads removed and placed at their feet, a practice understood as severing the ability of the dead to navigate back to the world of the living. These were not primitive superstitions. They were systematic, practiced responses to a specific category of fear that the Norse world took entirely seriously. The fear that the dead do not always stay dead. That the boundary between the living and the dead is not stable. That something you buried might come back, and that when it did, it would not be the person you knew. The sagas that deal with Draugr read, in their emotional register, less like horror stories and more like legal proceedings. There is a correct way to deal with a Draugr. You find the mound, you enter it, you wrestle the Draugr into submission, which requires not just courage, but a specific kind of ritual knowledge. Then you remove the head and burn the body and scatter the ashes where they cannot be collected. The process is methodical because the fear was methodical. It had a shape, it had rules. That is what distinguishes Norse fear from simple terror. The sea deserves its own category because the Norse relationship with it was complicated in a way that the fearless seafarer image completely misses. Yes, they sailed it. Yes, they were extraordinarily skilled at navigating it, but the Old Norse literary tradition is saturated with the terror of the ocean in a way that you do not find in cultures that were not spending their lives on it. The sea in Norse mythology is home to the Midgard serpent Jormungandr, a creature so large it encircles the entire world and bites its own tail. Thor fights it at Ragnarok and kills it and then takes 9 steps and dies from its venom. The sea is not celebrated in Norse cosmology. It is the location of one of the primary agents of apocalypse. The practical fear was specific. Drowning at sea, like straw death, was a death outside the warrior category. You could not die sword in hand if you were underwater. Drowning meant hell, not Valhalla, and hell was a kind of spiritual poverty that a warrior culture found genuinely horrifying. The practical consequence was that many Norse sailors did not swim, not because they didn't know how, but because the swimming man who was going to drown anyway was simply postponing the inevitable. If the sea wanted you, the sea would have you. Swimming was, in some documented cases, seen as an undignified resistance to a fate already sealed. This sounds fatalistic to modern ears. It was not quite fatalism. It was something more active and stranger. The Norse framework accepted the inevitability of bad outcomes while insisting on the importance of how you met them. You could not stop the sea from taking you. You could control whether you went down fighting, praying correctly, composing a final verse, maintaining your dignity in the face of something you could not defeat. The quality of the ending mattered enormously even when the ending itself was not in question. The darkness deserves mention, because Scandinavian winter is dark in a way that Southern Europeans who wrote about the Norse people found incomprehensible and that contributed to the Norse mythological imagination in ways that are hard to fully separate from the culture. The winter darkness of the far north is not simply a period of shorter days. At high latitudes, it is weeks of near-total absence of sunlight, punctuated by brief twilight hours that feel less like day than like the memory of day. The sun in Norse myth is explicitly a being soul who drives a chariot across the sky and is chased by a wolf called Skal. Every day, Sol runs and every day Skal chases, and at Ragnarok the wolf will catch her and swallow the sun, and the darkness will be permanent. People who live through months of real darkness every year do not come up with that image by accident. The sun being chased by something that wants to eat it forever is not an abstract theological proposition. It is a direct expression of an annual experience of watching the light fail and feeling in the body the possibility that this time it might not come back. The Norse feared the dark not as a phobia but as a lived reality that their mythology encoded and addressed. The return of the light in spring was not taken for granted. It was a relief. It was proof that the wolf had not yet caught the sun, that the end had not yet come, that there was still time. What all of these fears have in common is that they are not really fears of specific things. They are fears of meaning collapsing, fear of a death that doesn't count, fear of a name that disappears, fear of the dead who return wrong, fear of a sea that takes you without the possibility of glory, fear of a darkness that becomes permanent. Every specific fear in the Norse framework points toward the same underlying terror, that existence is fragile, that meaning is contingent, and that the structures human beings build to make life bearable can be undone. The fearless Viking is a myth. The real Vikings were afraid of exactly the things a people should be afraid of who have thought seriously and without consolation about what existence actually is. They were afraid of meaninglessness. They were afraid of being forgotten. They were afraid that the story they were living in would end before they had done anything worth remembering. That is not a primitive fear. That is the fear at the bottom of every human life, dressed in furs and armor and sent out into the North Atlantic to meet it head on.